Oh, well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this long awaited stream, at least long awaited by me, because I've been long awaiting the subject matter of this stream. We finally got Alex Van Halen, Freudian slip, that we finally got Alex Van Halen's book out. His book, all about a lot of things that you would expect, a lot of things you wouldn't expect, and something not about some of the things you would expect. If you're going to watch this live, please feel free to jump into the chat, send a super chat to support this channel because Peter Piker People Peppers. Never be able to say that, but do send a super chat if you're interested in coming along for the ride. So that out of the way. Let's jump in to some of the background behind this book. Well, as we all know, Eddie Van Halen died in the year 2020, and that was the first time in Alex's life, literally his whole life, where he had been without Eddie for a significant period of time. And we really get the feeling of what that meant in the book, and we really come to understand from the earliest pages of the book that that's why Alex wrote the book. The book is really two things, and in those two things there are many sort of subsets of thoughts and ideas and narratives. The first thing is that the book is a love letter to his deceased brother, and he's very clear about that, and he's incredibly sincere about it. He's spoken in interviews and he talks in the book itself about how the process of grief is one that involves many things, and one of the therapeutic things within that process is reflecting. And this book is a reflection, but that reflection really is expressed best as kind of a love letter to his brother, who he had never been without until 4 years ago. The other thing that the book is a love letter to music itself, and a kind of expose on what it means to grow up where music isn't just everything, but it's pretty much the only thing. The main connection that both of the brothers had to their father, we learn very early on, is music, and that connection continued. Of course, they spent a lot of time drinking together. Alex said that that was how they communed, but it was even more than that, the music that kept them together. And they were a very tight family. Yes, the mother was very strict, as we already knew, but the music was really at the core of the things that went on in that household. And if you're looking sort of for narratives that are completely new or unfamiliar, you probably won't be finding that, because much of what has been said in the book was said previously by people, including the brothers themselves, in interviews by other biographers. But there are really a lot of shots taken at those other biographers by Alex. He's clearly the very protective of the two brothers, and he is very honest about that. Eddie was the more shy and introspective one. Eddie was the one who was willing to just go for it without thinking, where Alex was the one always, both in a literal physical sense, in a musical sense, in a contractual sense, in a metaphysical sense. He was always the one looking after his slightly younger brother. And that's clearly something that has not changed at all since Eddie's death. If anything, one could make an argument that one of the sort of subtexts in this book is that Alex is now being defensive in many ways of Eddie's reputation, which a lot of people want to sort of seize as their own, which a lot of people want to define in their own way, and which a lot of people, in Alex's words, has been misconstrued and distorted. And so it's a lot about this continued defense of his little brother. And in insofar as it is, Alex is super sincere. So the childhood sections of the book are really dominated by music as the continual theme through everything. It's what got them through several moves away from their home, and eventually the big move to Pasadena, California. And one of the interesting things was how he contrasted Holland with LA in those very early days, when he was picked up at the train station from, I believe, one of his mother's relatives who had a beautiful convertible convertible Ford. He mentioned that oranges were only a penny. This was, of course, during the days of the gold standard, before Bretton Woods fell apart. So, you know what that means if you know. And how there was really a bright, sunny optimism that two kids who didn't like the cold weather they were born into really, really loved. There was also the difficult side of being the outsiders because it was an unfamiliar language and an unfamiliar culture. But through all of that, music is what kept them together. It seemed that the best days of their lives were when they got instruments. And we all know the story of Alex originally being the guitar player and Eddie originally being the drummer, and then they swapped. And of course, that's discussed. But one of the things that he talked a lot about Eddie is how Eddie could have really been a virtuoso on any musical instrument. He talks about there was a studio they were in, and Eddie picked up a bassoon. He could play it. And the bassoon is not an easy instrument in terms of technique or in terms of even getting it to produce a reasonable sound. It's not that easy, but Ed just had this uncanny ability to make music happen with anything that he touched. Now, one of the other early themes in this book is that the first person to really make a huge impact on their life outside of the family, and specifically outside of their musician father, Jan Van Halen, this was David Lee Roth. And because a lot of people, based on the interviews that Alex was giving in the days and weeks before the book came out as well, I thought these guys hated Roth. I thought that he made things difficult. I thought that he was the one responsible for the sort of tribute concert that Alex was kind of sort of putting together a few years back, not coming through. So what's with this? Well, all of that is really clarified in a really interesting way in the book. Now, throughout the book, it's made clear that Alex and Eddie were very different characters from Roth, and that much we already know. But it's really super interesting to hear just how Alex describes these differences. Eddie and Alex cared only about music and music alone. They didn't really have any ideas about stage presence, about how to sell yourselves as a band, how to look the part, how to even have a decent name for the band. They were just interested in writing and playing and gigging. That's what they lived and died for. Where Dave was this sort of permanently, you could call it ADHD, you could call it hyperactive, but he was definitely eccentric from a very young age. The David Lee Roth that the world came to know was apparently the David Lee Roth as a kid that Eddie and Alex came to know. And he presents the story of the band, frankly, from its earliest incarnations right up until just before the end of that classic lineup as sort of the Three Musketeers. Obviously, the two brothers were the closest, but he really sees Roth as someone who was vitally implicit in what happened to the band, not just because he was able to dress the band and sell the band and have ideas for how to promote the band and do things on stage to entertain crowds who might not be sophisticated enough to appreciate the great guitar playing and the great drumming going on. And so, for all that, there's definitely a feeling that Alex is eternally grateful. And that just as he says several times in the book, that even when he disagreed with something Eddie did, he would always defend it because he's my brother. That almost applies to Dave. And I think that's one of the reasons why, for all of the sort of analysis about Dave's more quirky and some would say negative attributes that Alex is very candid about, there is that sort of Three Musketeer attitude. And one of the things that really made that clear is their producer who produced all of the Roth era albums, Ted Templeman. He was a big Warner Brothers producer. He worked with the Doobie Brothers, Van Morrison. He worked with everyone. He was a hot shot producer and made a lot of money doing it. And when they were recording the first album, Ted wanted to get rid of David Lee Roth because he thought he wasn't a good enough singer. And ironically, he wanted to bring in Sammy Hagar. That was one of only about 2 references to Hagar in the entire book. And we'll get to that in a bit. But the band made it very clear, Alex being the kind of spokesman for the band, because while Eddie and Alex were both vocal, Alex was definitely always the more vocal one. And I think that that really sort of ties into that perpetual role that he fulfilled as Eddie's defender in chief. So they told Ted basically to F off with that idea. Dave got some vocal lessons to meet everyone halfway, and everything was fine. By the second album, Ted was very much on board with that decision remaining in place. But getting back to sort of these early days, notice how I keep referencing this idea about the three musketeers, when obviously Van Halen was a quartet, and Michael Anthony on bass and backing vocals is someone that I've championed as a great musician for a long time, because objectively he is. Now, obviously, Dave joined with the brothers a bit before, because the first sort of real bass player they had was a guy called Mark Stone, who later Alex said regretted sort of being a bit prevaricating about whether he wanted to stick with the band, and he didn't. But the guy they found was Michael Anthony, whose name doesn't really appear much. One of the only things that he said is that at the beginning they didn't think his bass sound was sort of big and fat enough. That changed, but that they always knew that he was a great harmonizer. But even then, he said something. This is Alex talking now, that Ed said also later on in Ed's life, which is that people give Michael Anthony credit for creating that harmony sound, but it was really he and Eddie Van Halen harmonizing which made that sound, which is true. But obviously, between the two of them, Michael Anthony's voice is stronger, but Alex definitely seems to underrate his contribution. And even though that isn't particularly surprising, seeing as the two of them aren't on speaking terms, you would have thought, well, some might have thought, that in a biography as comprehensive about the early years of the band as this is, that there would have been more mention of Michael Anthony. But I mean, there are producers and managers and engineers like Don Landy who are mentioned not only much more frequently, but in a much more positive light. Ted Templeman is someone that Alex doesn't like much, and he's mentioned a lot. He's mentioned factually, and in that sense, he's mentioned a lot, but he has a bit of a jab at him saying, oh, I still don't get why Jump wouldn't be big and all these things, because Ted didn't think Jump would be a big song, which is obviously, it just goes to show that experience doesn't always equal knowing what music is good. But there's definitely no love lost there between Alex and Ted. The relationship with Don Landy, the longtime engineer, much more positive in Alex's own words. And you can kind of understand, because as an engineer, Don was just there to help and create a sound that they wanted, where Ted had a lot of ideas about what he thinks the sound should be, which wasn't always the same as the band, what he thinks a hit should be, etc. All of that kind of stuff. But it is interesting that Ted's name is mentioned a lot more than Michael's. I don't know if this is because Alex really didn't place much credence, much value on Michael Anthony's contributions to the band, or if it's because of this personal dislike. And obviously, that personal dislike is something that not many people on the outside can really figure out, because Michael Anthony is known very objectively as a really nice guy. He's sort of drama free in this whole Van Halen scenario. He never made a fuss. He always turned up on time. He never played a bad gig. It's sort of, what more do you want? Maybe the reason he isn't mentioned is because there is so little drama, but I don't know. There seems to be some motivation behind the idea that a band that we, the public, we, the fans, always thought of as a quartet is kind of being referred to as a trio. The three of us thought this, the three of us did that, meaning the two brothers and Dave. So that, I thought, is something really interesting. And I'm sure when a lot of others out there read the book, they'll be hyper focused, or at least aware of that. Other things that really stuck out, and this goes back to the idea about this book being centered on music. Yes, it's a book about a family, but it's also a book about music. And Alex was very defensive, I think quite rightly, of the band, that he didn't like being lumped in with other bands in genre genres and styles that really didn't feel like Van Halen. So, for instance, when the record company in the very early days, this would be Warner, thought, well, punk is a big thing now in the late 70s. Let's try to make them appeal to that audience. But obviously, that's not what they are. And Alex talked in particular at that point about how punk was associated with being very political, and that Jan said something very important: never alienate half your audience, never go political. And the other thing that made them different from punk, in Alex's words, is that punk was sort of very downtrodden music, very angry. Van Halen's music was very happy. You could say that it's virtuosic party music. If you want to hear really good writing and really good playing that leaves you with a smile on your face, just put on any Van Halen track from any album. And I stand by that. And I think that he really conveyed that well. And once they became famous, now we're in the early 80s, and he talks about how a lot of Van Halen clones come along. A lot of people attempting to play like Eddie, to look like Dave on stage, to have guitars that are either indirect or in some cases direct copies of Eddie's famous Frankenstrat, the Frankenstein guitar, and how Eddie really resented that, and so did Alex. And Alex made the point that, one, we're not a heavy metal band because we're actual musicians who burn. But interesting, I get where he's coming from, but because I will say that the clones, the bands that tried to be Van Halen at that time, and he gives a list of bands, and among them is Guns N' Roses, who are genuinely talented. And yeah, they came a bit later, but among a lot of the bands that were sort of a bit more fly by night, or even the ones that made it big that were consciously trying to copy Van Halen, a lot of them sucked. And the reason for that is you cannot copy the genuine virtuosity of Eddie Van Halen. And you also can't copy the stage presence of everyone's favorite sort of Bugs Bunny meets Liberace character, which is David Lee Roth. For Dave, it really was his personality. And Alex made it clear that in Dave's own words, from the moment he wakes up till the moment he goes to sleep, he's on, meaning that personality, call it a persona, is on. There was something kind of funny that Alex said about Dave, even though he's quite deferential and respectful to Dave, even when criticizing. And this is the line about, oh, well, Dave's never is the only one in the band who's never had a girlfriend, let alone a wife, and only he can tell you why. Is that a euphemism for something? But he did, in another section of the book, kind of clarify that and say that, well, yeah, it is true that Dave bought a lot of his clothes at the sort of LGBT types of boutiques and the S&M boutiques, that for Dave, none of the stuff that he wore was ever a kind of acknowledgement that he was a part of a certain lifestyle, or even curious about it at a fundamental level. For Dave, all of the world was a wardrobe, and the costumes were just a chance to affect a character. So I think we can make of that what we can. The androgyny of Dave was really his own creation, rather than the acknowledgement of being part of a movement. And Alex does very much acknowledge that which sort of gained the constant attention, it helped the band. There is no doubt about it that fusion of this sort of Bugs Bunny meets Liberace character, plus these two guys who eat, drink, smoke, and snort music 24/7, it was the winning factor. I would say that Michael Anthony brought a hell of a lot to the table too. Alex doesn't seem to agree on that part. Let's see what else was interesting. And this is all just me trying to remember what sticks out. I'm not trying to give away any spoilers because you really have to read Alex's words. And I will just say, as an aside, I didn't read it. I listened to it as an audiobook on Spotify. And the reason I did that is because Alex was reading it himself. And as I was saying in a previous video, it is not easy to be a voiceover artist overnight if it's something that you're not experienced in or naturally gifted in. But I think Alex did really well. You can hear that really dry sense of humor. You can hear that from an objective type of personality whose views on the world are rather middle of the road. Whenever the bursts of philosophy and creativity and spirituality come out, you can hear it in his intonation. You can definitely hear it in Alex's voice. Do we need more light? Probably not. But so anyway, one of the things that I really liked is whenever Alex was telling a story that he genuinely found amusing, he'd punctuate a sentence with "ha." Kind of, a drier version of a James Brown lick type of thing. And so you could tell when he was really sort of reflecting back on something that made him happy, that gave him amusement. So that was so getting to the first album, he said that they didn't like the sound. They thought there wasn't enough bottom end. No mention of Michael Anthony. He hated the way that Don removed the front bass drum heads, which was a rather typical procedure in studios who wanted more of a solid and punchy bass drum sound rather than a more ringy and reverberant one. He thought that half of the mics on the drums weren't picking up the toms. But he did say that by the second album, he preferred the sound. He thought that Don had mic'd up the drums better and that they were getting closer. But that in terms of the sound, the only time that he thinks Don really got it totally right was 1984, which was the first album recorded at 5150 Studios. And the building of that studio and how it came about was heavily detailed in the book. Now, the reason that he thinks 1984 was recorded the best is that the drums were high in the mix, and they were higher than on the previous albums, or frankly, on most of the later albums. He liked how it was a very hot album. It was an album that really was dynamically very forward, very much. You could hear both the guitar and the drums in a lot of detail. It had some oomph to it, even though, frankly, I was kind of surprised when he said there's not enough bass on the first album, which, frankly, with the exception of Fair Warning, had the most bass of any of the Van Halen albums up to For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, the first not engineered by Landy in totality. There is the story that obviously isn't in this book that I'm reminded of, which is when Chris Bellman was set to remaster all of the Roth era albums, and he remarked, well, maybe we could use a bit more bass in the mastering process. And he presented that to Eddie, and Eddie said, no, no, no. And the result of these remasters by Chris Bellman, which are very highly regarded, is very strong in crisp mid-range and treble, not so fat in the bass. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The third album was an interesting discussion on women and children first, all about the Wurlitzer keyboard that Eddie played through a Marshall and how they jammed on one riff and one riff alone for hours. And the two of them ended coming up with what I think is probably one of the most classic tracks ever, which is And the Cradle Will Rock. Fair Warning, arguably the best Van Halen album ever, although they'll always never be a consensus on that. That album, which a lot of people consider one of the darker Van Halen albums, but also one of the most virtuosic. A lot of what was going on there is frustrations within the band that Eddie needed to let out. Frustrations with Ted Templeman, his insistence on things like covers and single friendly material. And this was the first time that sort of between these three musketeers, there was beginning to be some discord among the ranks, where Dave was becoming incredibly more bossy, if you will. He wanted to take more of a leadership will, and this was frustrating Eddie. And what frustrated Eddie creatively frustrated Alex, because creatively they were really for the most part almost always on the same page. And so this album, Fair Warning, was really Eddie's sort of saying, look, I'm going to do things my way and I'm going to fight the entire world in the process. And the result was an album that most fans really love. The story of Diver Down is rather more familiar. The band wanted a break, so they put out a quick cover of as a single of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman. It went to number one, or I don't remember, maybe not one, but it went up the charts bigly, as someone would say. And so the studio made them do an album. There wasn't enough material at such short notice, so there were a lot of covers, which Eddie hated. But and this is again another reason that I think that Dave and Alex remain close, is that it was Dave's suggestion to play this song on Diver Down, Big Bad Bill is Sweet William Now, and have Jan Van Halen come out of retirement and play the clarinet. And Alex said that for him, this is something where even if Dave was motivated by selfish reasons, oh, let's put a gimmick on the album, he said that he'll forever be grateful to Dave for that suggestion, because it was the only time where the brothers played together with their father in a professional studio environment, and it was probably the last recording that their father ever made. It was a few years before where Alex said they were getting some money finally after signing a really bad contract with Warner. The money was starting to come in enough to buy their parents a house and to tell Jan to retire. And he said that he and Eddie both regretted forever their insistence that Jan retire, because they saw that without playing live professionally, it really shortened his life. And now he was always a heavy drinker, but without the gigging, even some gigging, it's really all that he had was the drinking. But luckily on Diver Down, they did bring him out of retirement. And as it was Dave's suggestion, this is yet another thing that makes them very much loyal to, at least in Alex's case, but he seems to be speaking for both of them, both brothers at this point, grateful for bringing him in. Now, it was also at this point that he talks about the first real creative frustration with his brother. And he made it clear the stipulation is that he'll always side with his brother, but he hated, and by his tone on the audiobook, still hates the fact that Eddie decided to take up Quincy Jones's offer and play guitar on Michael Jackson's Thriller on the beated track. Alex referenced Jan in talking about how you need to be laser focused with your creativity. Creativity is finite, and that in Alex's view, whatever great creative burst you have should be saved for a Van Halen album, and a Van Halen album alone. He seems quite angry at the fact that the Beat It solo is considered one of Eddie's best, and it wasn't on a Van Halen album. Eddie seemed to take it. He asked his brother for advice. He got it, but he went ahead and did it anyway. And Alex was very upset with this. But within all of their fights, they remained very closely bonded forever. And this was something that came out very clearly in the book Sammy Hagar wrote about his life, a lot of which revolved around Van Halen, about how no one could fight like these two brothers, but no two brothers were ever closer. And that observation is really doubled down on in this book. Alex said that one of the knock-on effects of the Michael Jackson thing is that it started to give Dave ants in his pants about doing other things, seeing as that he wasn't getting all of his show tunes on the albums. You know, fair warning again was the total rebellion against the show tune mentality. And so there was that. But there was one collaboration, which, even though Alex didn't seem perfectly thrilled about it either, that did lead to something super important. And this was, of course, his collaboration with Dweezil Zappa, because through his friendship with Frank and friendship with Dweezil, he saw the benefit, some would even say the utility, of having a home studio. For those who don't get the joke, Frank Zappa's home studio is called the Utility Muffin Kitchen. And in producing the first single that Dweezil ever wrote, called My Mother is a Space Cadet, albeit not on his name, he and Don Landy did that together. It made him realize that if he really wanted to get his way and his way alone, he needed his own home studio. And so it was that 5150 was to be built, and Alex goes into all of the stories about that, most of which we've heard before, but again, it's super unique and super interesting for him to tell them. And one of the things I found from a drummer's perspective, but I think a lot of musicians would find this interesting, is he said one of the things he liked about that 5150 Studios era is that he and Ed could jam literally right next to each other in the studio, because he started playing Simmons electric drums. So you don't have to worry about the drum mics needing to be sufficiently separated from the mic on the cab for the guitar amplifier, or let alone ISO booths or anything like that. And he talks about how a lot of fans gave him, crap about electronic drums. But he said, look, and he sort of rationalizes this in an interesting way. When you're hearing an acoustic drum set on record or even through a PA, the sound is being processed electronically via something called a microphone. So, what's the difference between the electronics in a microphone picking up the sounds of a drum and an electronic drum that just goes directly into the board? Make of that what you will. And I will say that of all of the people who played Simmons drums in around this time, Alex made them sound most drum-like. They didn't sound sort of overly trebly or anemic in terms of their reverberation. He really knew how to bring out the best of them in this rock context. And so I thought as a drummer that was something that really stuck out to me. Of course, I'm skipping over some of the things here. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff about how they graduated from house parties and smaller clubs in Pasadena to the Sunset Strip while retaining the shows that they learned to put together themselves as promoters and managers of themselves. The shows, the regular shows at the very beautiful 1920s era Pasadena Civic, but it was really graduating to the club scene on the Sunset Strip that helped them to get the attention of the music industry world, because that's where they would go to hear the bands. He talked about how the first real gig they got in the West Hollywood area was at a place called Gazzari's. It later became the Key Club. Now it's something else. But when it was Gazzari's, it was sort of the worst of all of the big Sunset Strip clubs. The Roxy and the Whiskey and the Troubadour on Santa Monica being a lot more prestigious. He only wanted covers. Didn't want originals. It didn't pay great. And later, Alex said that Mr. Gazzari said, "Oh, I discovered them," which Alex called bullshit. But he gave them their first inroad into the heart of the music scene geographically in LA. And then they eventually graduated to a larger club on Santa Monica and Crescent Heights called the Starwood. Before that, it was sort of like a jazz lounge club called PJ's. Then it became the Starwood, very legendary. And that was the gig from where they were discovered. But it was also at this time that they started becoming an opening act for very important bands. One of their best gigs at that time was opening for Santana at the Long Beach Arenas. So they really were, and this is again something that was known, but it's really interesting to hear it from the horse's mouth, or in this case, from Alex Van Halen's mouth, how they really were a band where their heart and soul, everything they did, involved gigging and lots of it. And so that, I think, was a super important sort of theme that ran right throughout the book. Now, in terms of the emotional aspects of the book, those run really hot and heavy. It's really clear that Alex's love for his brother is absolutely supreme. You can tell in the interviews that they did together in their lifetime that they truly were, they really truly were a band of brothers, with an emphasis frankly more on the brothers than the band, because those two things frankly they go so together when we're talking about Van Halen. Now, some would say that this book is a bit biased because it's written from such a singular perspective. And one of the things that might reflect that is his way of not only treating Michael Anthony, who was there from the early days, but his way of mentioning Sammy Hagar. He only mentioned his name, I think, twice, maybe three times I think really only twice. And it was pretty sarcastic. One time was when Ted Templeman wanted him to join the band early on, and they poo-pooed that. The other time was in the early 80s when Sammy opened for Van Halen, and he was giving the list of people opening for them, and the way he phrased it, and some guy you probably never heard of, Sammy Hagar. Obviously, it's a joke, but I definitely get the feeling that there's not a lot of love left between those two. Now, Sammy, in a very sort of classy way, retaliated on his social media by presenting a clip from an MTV interview from the 5150 tour, where Alex praises Sammy joining the band, saying that it's opened up Ed to do so much more, particularly on keyboards, because Sammy's a good guitar player. So Eddie could play rhythm guitar so Sammy could play rhythm guitar while Eddie plays keyboards, not having to worry about anything like that. And I thought that was interesting. And it also harkens back to the fact that the first two albums had pretty much no overdubs, a fact that Alex says Eddie was super proud of. And all of the albums, even when they started to do some overdubs, that all of the albums, certainly in that Roth era, and even to a degree later on, they were pretty damn live. And that was something that Eddie and Alex were happy about. Another interesting story. We all know that Gene Simmons almost signed the band. He got them to record their first demo, but that even then they really stood on business. They did not let someone much more famous, because this was just when they were a club band in West Hollywood. They didn't let them push him around, because he said, "Oh, you've all got to buy black leather and you've got to change your name." And one of the names he thought of was Virus, which, looking back, I'm really glad they didn't pick that name. I think that even before what we know now about viruses, or maybe what we don't know, I think it just, the name sounds sort of nasty. And like those bands like Rat actually was one of the better bands of that era, but or Poison, it's like a bit of the cliche, where Van Halen is just, it's a cool sounding name, and it says what the band is. It's the Band of Brothers. So in rejecting his advice on that, I think that that was pretty wise. And the band, they definitely always had a combination of swagger and humility. They, in the words of Alex, and this is again me trying to quote him off the top of our head, "We weren't as good as we thought we were, but we were sure better than everyone else thought we were." If that's not a brilliant motivational quote from musicians who know they're good but want to always get better, I don't know how you could really top that. The book ends with Alex speaking directly to Eddie, and I won't even try to quote it. You've just got to read or listen to it for yourself. And there are tear-jerking moments. There's laughter, and when all is said and done, I'll say that since Bill Bruford's autobiography that came out maybe in, I think, 2007, if my memory is correct, which it may not be, I think this is the best music autobiography slash biography that I've read since then, because it really makes it clear that through the thick and thin, through love and through fights, through ups and downs, through marriage and divorce, through happiness and strife, if you, as the person you love, and no one loved each other more than these two brothers, if you can have something like create a creative outlet, in this case music, to bond you together through life, nothing can really touch you, and nothing can get you down. And I think it's a very powerful message. It's a very sincere message, and hearing Alex read it is both refreshing and different, because he's sort of in many ways the lost person that you would think would tell the story. He was sort of the less vocal in public. In private, it was somewhat different of the two brothers. Dave and Sammy are both much more vocal. Michael, when he's on interviews, is way more relaxed. So hearing it from this unique voice, but the one who was the only one there since literally day one as the slightly older brother, I think it's a really fascinating account of what music means to people, how it's related to love, how it's related to brotherhood, and how music conquers all. And to top everything off, Alex released an unfinished jam that he did with his brother when his brother was alive. Eddie's playing acoustic and electric guitar, as well as keyboards on this track, while Alex lays down the drums. It's really good. So definitely check that out. I highly recommend that you read this book, brothers. You will not be disappointed. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel. Please share, and now you can become a member. You can help keep this channel alive by paying for a membership that will give you really exclusive perks. So maybe we can even talk with each other, or even for more money we can argue. I kid, I'm not that argumentative, or am I? Find out. You can also in future shows send a super chat. That always helps as well. So that's the commercial for me. Everything that came before it was a commercial. commercial, a free commercial for Alex Van Halen's book, but definitely check it out. It's really something that I've listened to now several times. You won't be disappointed. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.